Why would anyone want to talk about their mental illness? It seems like such an odd thing, especially when we live in a culture where victimhood seems to be a badge of honor. That you ask the question, by talking about my mental illness, am I lifting the importance of the mental illness, or am I lifting the importance of talking about mental illness? We're going to talk about that and more today on Shattered the Podcast. Let's go.
Welcome to Shattered the Podcast.
Sharing the lived experience of mental illness on
A father,
a mother.
A family.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go.
Let's go.
G'day, and welcome to Shattered the Podcast. This is Mark. Today we're talking about why you should talk about your mental illness. It's an interesting thought, and when I ask that question, I will always give myself the negatives. Why shouldn't I talk about mental illness? Why shouldn't I be open about the struggles that I'm going through? And the reasons are many and multitude to not discuss mental illness. And as mentioned in the intro, sometimes it's about that stigma. It's about, am I creating myself, am I cornering myself into needing to be a victim and have that as my identity, this victim identity? Another reason not to talk about it is the stigma. Are people going to think badly about me because I have a mental illness? And we need to take a hard look at ourselves, because I know from personal experience that I used to look down on people with mental illness. People would just not show up to work. They couldn't handle the pace, the environment, the physical violence that we dealt with in the workplace. They just couldn't handle it. And one day they would just not show up. And we would make fun of those people. I remember one case in particular. I had to take a client down to another house that was close to ours. We just needed to get some paper. I didn't know that the staff member in the house had been violently assaulted by the client that was with me, who incidentally ended up violently assaulting me, which led to my PTSD. Well, we went down to this house. She freaked out when she saw this client. She slammed the door. She would only speak through the door. She didn't want to see the client. And to my eternal shame, I ridiculed and mocked her for her response. She had just seen her assailant. She had just seen the person that had led to extensive mental health issues. And that incidental contact, I never did check to see what the result was, but I know that she wasn't working there the next time I went down a couple of weeks later. I used to make fun of people that would mention the fact that they are dealing with mental illness. I made fun of the fact that they weren't able to make it in my industry. And you have to understand, I was working with people with disabilities. I worked with all races, colors, creeds, types, bodies, sexualities. Never had a problem with anybody. But I would make fun of people, that staff members that presented with mental illness. Now, if you were a client of mine and you had a dual diagnosis, I would think nothing of that. There would be no diminishment in my eyes for you in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I would probably care for you more because I know more about your condition. But when it came to other staff members, other people just like me, that couldn't hack the pace, that couldn't deal with the punishment anymore, the violence, the trauma, and we would make fun of them. This poor woman that I accidentally introduced a client to, I went back, I was flabbergasted. Why did she freak out like that? What's wrong with her? Would try and make funny stories out of it. So when we all say that there are no stigmas towards mental illness, you need to dig deeper. You need to think about, would you employ somebody if you're an employer? If somebody came to you and they had every credential in the book, they'd had experience, but they mentioned that they were bipolar and sometimes it affected them. As an employer, what would you do? Would you take that candidate who is more experienced, who knows the job well, but who might, because of my stigma, be unable to produce 100% all the time? Or do I take the less experienced person that doesn't struggle with mental illness? Sadly, people are going to go with the lesser experienced person. It's a natural thing. It's horrible and it's terrible, but when it comes down to it, mental illness is that last stigma, is that last thing that, we look at these people and we do diminish them just by our reaction to them, finding out that they have a mental illness. Well, I might be careful about how I talk to them, so I'm not treating them normally. I'm doing the best that I can. And I'm not talking about people doing this because they're bigots or arrogant or whatever. I'm talking about good, kind hearted people, which I was, working in an industry that was the most undervalued industry that you could work in, working with people with disabilities. We were the most underpaid. A career in that sector guaranteed that you would never be able to buy a house. Everybody I knew had to marry somebody with money to get ahead in life. And yet, when it came to other staff members who may have mental illness, I thought less of them. Of course, when I got hurt, it changed everything. And I've said this a lot. I never understood people that complained about a bad back until I had a bad back. And then the enormity of the pain and discomfort that you go through with a bad back, it's incredible. I'm surprised some people with really bad backs ever get out of bed. Why is it not the case with mental illness? And why is it the case that people might look at it and go, well, how can I possibly understand if I've not had it? If I've never hurt my back badly, how can I possibly understand? Well, that comes from empathy. That comes from an acknowledgement that I might not know your exact situation, but I'm able to look beyond that, and I'm able to look at you and say, okay, you may not be able to do some things, but that doesn't mean that you're less than. I saw a little kid yesterday in a wheelchair with cerebral palsy at the movies. And part of me was instantly went, why bother bringing a vegetable to the movies? I was horrified at this thought. I mean, there's this thought that had never occurred to me. I'd taken thousands of clients to hundreds of movies over my career. I'd taken them to fun parks. I'd taken them to showgrounds. I'd taken them to dog shows. I'd taken them to concerts. I'd taken them to the beach. It's their guaranteed right to be able to enjoy the same things that everybody else does. But it's that natural, instinctive kind of repelling that I had against this guy. And unfortunately, he is one of my triggers. So I wasn't able to quash that and just go over and say hello to him. But I made sure that I smiled. And it took every ounce of strength that I had in me to smile at this kid, because inside it all started to happen. The flashes in the corner of my eyes, the symptoms of the trauma, the PTSD symptoms came back until I was able to get past him and get far away from him. But what is it in me that made me think that? What is it that makes us think that, oh, if somebody's got a mental illness, if they've got a diagnosis, I mean, it's almost good now to say that you've got PTSD. because people are like, okay, it's bad. I don't understand it, but you seem normal and you're able to live a normal life, so I get it. But if I tell somebody that I'm bipolar or that I have dissociative disorder or that I have obsessive compulsive disorder, we're still going to be repelled by that diagnosis just because of the stigma that our society has given around people with mental illness, their abilities and the things that they aren't able to do, and the supposed violence that they all project because of their mental illness. I mean, I grew up in a time when the horror films were all about psychos, Leatherface, the guy from Friday the 13th, the dude from Nightmare on Elm Street. They were all mental. They were all crazy through trauma. That's what we grew up thinking that people with trauma were like. Did we intend it? No. Did anybody look at that and say, hang on, this isn't fair to people with mental illness? Yeah, maybe, but it wasn't loud. I mean, could you imagine trying to do like uh, Texas Chainsaw Massacre today, and instead of him just, you got hit in the head by a brick, just saying, well, this guy was disabled and now he's a psycho. You just couldn't do it. Thank God. So the question that I'm asking today is, why should I talk about trauma? First and foremost, it's for me. I talk about my mental illness for me because it helps digest the trauma. Now, I worked as a drive time radio announcer and I hid my mental illness. I hid the symptoms. I hid the trauma. I hid the difficulties that I'd have because I was able to just walk into a radio station and all you had to hear was my voice. And as long as I could make my voice sound the way that it generally did, unless you were my wife, you couldn't tell a difference. I was able to just be there, and it was good because here I am with a mental illness, and my job is to sit in a small room and talk to myself. Fantastic. Doesn't get any better than that. But the thing is, in radio particularly, I didn't understand that people were listening. I once mentioned by accident my daughter's nickname, Magoo. And I was out somewhere and a guy said, "Oh, are you Mark?" Because he recognized my voice of all things. And I said, Yeah, I am. And he said, "How's Magoo doing?" And instantly the father in me railed up and was like, "How the hell do you know my daughter's nickname? How could you possibly know that?" And I was like, because I'd mentioned it on the radio. So I didn't understand that the influence that I had as a radio announcer. So when I had a guest on and they said something along the lines of, they told me about their mental illness, the struggle that they came through, I was concluding the interview and I said something along the lines of, "Hey, having a mental illness myself, I understand the struggle you've been through and I congratulate you for it." And it was the first time I'd ever mentioned on air that I had a mental illness. And because it was a natural part of the conversation, I didn't actually realize I said it. I didn't realize what I was doing was exposing myself emotionally to the audience because, I'm a drive time radio announcer. I'm there to entertain. I'm not there to be this voice of, the downtrodden mentally ill people. I'm a drive time announcer. I'm supposed to get you home happy. But the phones just started ringing off the hook. We got text messages coming through. Whenever we did events, people would come up to me and they were just, "Mark, you're so brave talking about your mental illness." And in my head, I hadn't actually spoken about it. I just said that from personal experience, I understand. But to people listening, they'd never heard that from a drive time announcer. They'd never heard somebody on the radio, somebody that they liked, somebody that they enjoyed listening to, admitting that they live with a condition like this. So for me, talking about it, sure, I'd been to the psychologist. Sure, I'd was taking my medication. I was doing all those things that helped me. I was doing all the work that I needed to do. But I didn't realize that in beginning to talk about my trauma out loud to, admittedly, people that I couldn't see, I just started to become more comfortable and I started to become more healthy. The trauma that I'd gone through was able to be digested because it was outside of me. I was having this conversation with people and I started getting in guests and we started talking about mental health. We started getting in people like Lifeline and support agencies to talk about it more. And I'd open up more and more. And now I'm at a point where I can do a podcast about living with mental illness. I can go into schools and workplaces and speak in person to people about the experience of mental illness. And I'm good. I don't walk into a session and then come out the other side wounded. I come out empowered, thankful that my pain has a purpose. So the first thing about why do I talk about my trauma? Why should you talk about your trauma? Is to help digest it, to make it normal, to realize that it's a part of your life, but it's not the only part of your life. And it's not a part of your life that you have to be ashamed of. Second reason on why to talk about your mental illness is it helps you move beyond the trauma. When I was initially working through my PTSD symptoms, now I'd got hurt in a workplace. I was working with people with disability and acquired brain injury. And I had two aspects to me which made me very desirable in that workplace. I was male and I was strong. Uh, Clients, for whatever reason, if they were going to be violent, they knew instinctively that violence towards women was something that they could probably get away with. So they were a little bit shyer with me just because I was a man. The fact that I was really, really strong and I looked strong was also a deterrent. So clients that had negative behaviors would look at me and think twice. However, when they got to know me and realized I'm an absolute marshmallow and that I am just as sensitive and caring as any of the other women that I work with, that was broken down. But then I still have my strength. And when I began in the disability world, the first thing that they taught us was how to subdue a person without hurting them. They talked to us about using pressure points. They used to talk about what to do if somebody bites you. And surprisingly, if somebody bites you, you don't jerk your arm away. You actually grab them by the back of the head and push your arm as hard as you can into their mouth because it opens their jaw, causing them pain, and they'll release you. If you pull against it, your flesh will begin to tear, particularly if they've got it clamped around a chunk of your flesh. This was the environment that I worked in. When I was first hurt, I walked into a supermarket. I was going down one of the aisles, and a group house, a group of disabled people were at the end. Naturally, I turned around and started to go the other way. There was another group of disabled people at the other end of the hallway. I went into my trauma mode. I went into fight or flight. And this time, again, the voice in my head was saying that I can't hurt anyone. I can't do anything to damage anyone. So I have to run. I don't remember much of that day. I do remember climbing over the stack, knocking all the products off the shelf, collapsing down the other side, and fleeing. That's about the extent of my memory. I can't tell you details. I can't tell you much about what I saw and did and felt because it was a trauma situation. Now I can walk past a person with a disability, and yes, I am still, my body responds, but I've been able by talking about my trauma, by getting it out there, I'm able to not have it ruin my day. There was a time I'd see somebody with a physical, mental disability in a wheelchair, and that was me gone for the rest of the day. I was totally consumed with trying to deal with my symptoms. Couldn't do anything else. Couldn't relate to my family. Couldn't spend time with my kids. I was just stuck in this maintenance repair of the trauma of just seeing a person with a disability. Talking about this stuff has made me realize, it's made my rational mind able to say, well, look, what danger was I possibly in? Particularly from the weekend when I saw the little kid, 10, 11 years old, cerebral palsy, wheelchair bound. What could he possibly have done to me? What could he have done to hurt me? He's in a wheelchair. He's not going to be able to catch me. He might, because I'm old and fat. So, but realistically, there's nothing that this kid can do to me. And talking about my trauma, getting it out there, being able to discuss it has helped me now get to a point where my rational mind is able to override my subconscious fight or flight response. All right. So, of the 4 reasons, the first is help you digest the trauma. Second reason to talk about it is to move beyond the trauma. The third one, it sounds very similar to the others, but is very, very different in a couple of key ways, and that's to minimize the trauma. What do I mean by that? I mean by when you're driving along and you look in your rearview mirror and you see something happen behind you, car accident, a near accident, traffic, whatever. The further you drive away from it, the smaller it gets, the less important it seems. I was nearly totaled by a truck the other day. In the rain, he just came across, didn't know I was there. I fully thought, this is it. I'm going underneath this truck. I don't know how he missed me. I don't know what driving technique I employed, but I just knew that I had just escaped with my life. I had been in a near-death situation, and the cars, everybody around me knew. I had people winding down their windows. Are you all right, mate? Yeah, should we call the cops? They knew that something bad had happened. Sitting in that spot, sitting in the car with the engine off, panting and stuff, I was still in the middle of that trauma. But as I drove away from it, as I got further away from it, it got smaller and smaller in my agenda, my mindset. Now, the thing about trauma is that when you look at it in the rearview mirror, when you look back, it seems like it's right there. It seems like it's right outside the window. Drive as fast as you can. You can't get away from it. Think of that scene in Jurassic Park where the dinosaur is just, it's too fast. The guy's looking in the rearview mirror and the dinosaur is getting bigger. It's getting closer. That's what it's like when you carry around a mental illness. You don't look in the rearview mirror and see it getting smaller. You see it chasing you, following you, getting bigger. In talking about my trauma, it has started to minimize it. It's made it so that I can look in the rearview mirror and say, yes, it's a significant event. The dinosaur, the trauma is still there. But I'm now a long way beyond it. And I can look back, and its importance, it's the relevance to my current situation gets smaller and smaller the more I talk about it. And the more I talk about it, the story changes from talking about the trauma, the injury, to getting past the trauma, to talk about hope. So that's the third thing for me, is it minimizes the trauma. As I look back on it, as my memory dwells on it, it isn't all encompassing. It isn't everything I can see in the mirror. It's just part of the many, many things behind me. Yes, it's still significant. Yes, it still hurts. And yes, at times it still seems like it's right behind me. But for the most part, because I've been able to talk about it, the trauma is further and further away. Okie doke. So, 3 reasons is first of all to digest the trauma. Vietnam veterans, men back from war, told them not to talk about it. It's the worst possible thing you can do. Talking about it helps you digest your trauma, helps you to move beyond your trauma, helps you get to a point where you can envision a life without the trauma. It minimizes the trauma, which is the third thing. It makes it smaller. So when you look back on it, it doesn't seem as big. The fourth thing, probably the most important reason that I still do this, is to inspire others to acknowledge their trauma and to start to speak about it. Everything to do with Shattered the podcast is about trying to normalize the conversation around mental illness, making it so that it's not bizarre that somebody's on YouTube talking about mental illness, making it so that if an employee did go into a workplace, they wouldn't be afraid of letting their potential employer know that they have a mental illness because they know that it's going to be seen like anything else. If you have the best employee with the greatest credentials, the best experience, but they tell you they have epilepsy or they live in a wheelchair, you are going to say, I don't care. Because we've learned that things like epilepsy, things like wheelchairs are no deterrent to that person performing and succeeding the best that they can as long as there are safeguards employed. It's exactly the same with mental illness. But at what point is that going to be the norm? At what point are we going to be able to say in an interview, look, I have PTSD, I'm on medication, 99% of the time I am fantastic, but every once in a while I have to make accommodations for my illness. Somebody has a seizure in the workplace. Do we fire them? No. But somebody who is overwhelmed by their mental health symptoms, be it, I mean, I was in an office building, 4th floor, and a disabled person that I didn't know came into the building and he was screaming and shouting. Now, not every person with a disability that screams and shouts is violent. Clearly, that's not the case. But when you're in the middle of mental illness trauma, when you're in the middle of dealing with your symptoms, my mind assumed that this guy was here to kill me. How did I react? I didn't scream. I didn't shout. I just tried to leap out the 4th floor window. Thankfully, it had a lock on it. I was able to open it anyway, but then also thankfully there was another coworker who was just going, Mark, what are you doing? What is going on? Do they see that as me being crazy and a disruption in the workplace? Or can they see that as a legitimate mental illness response to an unusual stimuli? And then can we move past it? For me, it was just not making me do my work in the corridor. I was an extra person in that building at that time. And we were just waiting for a seat to open up. So they said, we'll just put him in the hallway. Well, the thing about that is I was completely exposed. They then found a cubicle for me, but it was back to the door. I said, I can't do this. They found me a cubicle facing the door. I just traded with somebody else. In the public service, I was working in a job. We moved areas, and where I had to sit was my back facing the elevator. I could not do it. But trying to get somebody to help me to understand, to not just say, oh, look, he's trying to get a better seat, instead of looking at it like that, which is the way they looked at it. Mark, you're the newest one here. You get the worst seat. That's just the way it works. Yeah, but whenever the elevator opens and people come through, it causes massive disruption to my mental health. And I have to escape. I have to leave the area. I have to leave the building. And at that point, I was going up to the 8th floor because that was where the break area was, and looking over the ledge, thinking, I could probably just die if I did this. The simple expedient, the simplest thing for them to do was to find me a chair that didn't face the door. And then these months of significant trauma that I went through that held back my mental health would have just disappeared. Because in the workplace, identify an issue. Oh, you have epilepsy. Well, let's not sit you in front of the strobe light. How does that sound? Oh, you've got epilepsy. Look, we've got this seat, but it faces outside, and outside the window is a sign that flashes all the time. Well, that's ludicrous. You wouldn't do that. But at the time, me saying, look, I have these mental health issues and it's bad for me to sit facing the elevator, instead of believing me and understanding me, I was seen as being difficult. I was seen as being a person that was trying to make everybody else's lives look hard. And why is that? It's because people don't understand. There's this talk at the moment about mental health awareness, and awareness is great. Awareness is good and it's necessary, but it's not understanding. We look at people in wheelchairs now and we don't see the disability. We see a person often. I will tell you, I know people in wheelchairs that do not feel like people at times, but society has come a long way from the way it was beforehand. I work with a wonderful woman in a wheelchair, former Australian of the Year, and I always feel ashamed when I am brought into a building through the front doors. I access it through the main entrance, and she's got to go around the back, around this corner, into a dingy elevator that's more often than not dirty and horrible and tiny. And then she comes out, and then she's able to meet the rest of us who have had this nice experience walking through this airy foyer, and she's had to do all this stuff. Clearly, there are things that we need to do to improve her situation, but it's so much better than when it used to be that she would have to park her wheelchair downstairs and either suffer the embarrassment of four guys trying to carry her up the stairs, or having to give up her wheelchair and be totally dependent on somebody else to carry her up, find her a chair. If she needs to go to the bathroom, that person needs to go with them. Now, I'm not saying that life is sweet and perfect for a person in a wheelchair. By no means is it. But at least there are people out there thinking that, okay, how can we make their life better? What are the things that we're doing to make them feel minimalized? And we don't look at them as a whinging person. We look at them as a valued member of our community that we've got to assist to have a better lifestyle, to have better access to services. And this woman speaks, and her talks are incredible. I will sit and listen to her all day, every day. I don't even care if I get to speak when she's around, because she is amazing. Her story is amazing. It's empowering. It's hopeful. And yet, because of lack of some understanding, sometimes she's treated as less than. But it's changing. And that's my point. At what point will we start to look at mental illness as being what it is, an injury, as being something that is not a death sentence? You don't need to be exiled because you have a mental illness. And that's where talking about it comes into play. We didn't understand because people in wheelchairs didn't have a voice. As soon as they started getting a voice, it was able to dawn on us that, oh, really? When I spoke to somebody the other day about how ashamed I was in this place, that my colleague had to go through this dingy back area and I didn't have to, and my instinct is to go through the tribulation that she goes through. So if she's going in a tiny elevator, if I'll fit, I'll go in that elevator. Problem is, the elevators are so tiny that I don't fit. I can't be in there without embarrassing her by sort of walking over her wheelchair. I mentioned to the dude that owned the place, and he said yes. He said, yes, I understand completely. And what we've done is we've tried better lighting. Obviously, an elevator is a big deal. He said, we know that the cleaners were neglecting it. We're getting them on it. Thank you for pointing it out. I'll check it. And we'll keep doing what we can to make things better. Imagine if that was the experience of people with mental illness, somebody that was struggling, somebody that can't do certain things because of their mental illness. If we became facilitators rather than critics and putting up obstacles and barriers. I can't work at the moment, not because of my mental health, but because of my back. I hurt my back really bad. If I go to a workplace and say I've got a bad back, they'll find a chair that's right for me. They'll get the OH&S people in. They'll do all that stuff to try and make it easier for me in the workplace so that I don't exacerbate my injury. But at the same time, if I tell them I've got a mental illness, I can't sit with my back to an open area. I can't, I won't be participating in informal drinks because it's not healthy for me. I won't be doing this. I won't be doing that. Now I'm seen as being a person that is difficult, hard to work with. Oh, Mark didn't say good morning to me today. What the hell is his problem? Well, in my head, all I'm doing is trying to get myself in a headspace where I can do the day's work with you. But you don't see that struggle. All you see is a blank face and somebody that's non-communicative. Sometimes my kids come up to me and will talk to me, and I have no idea that they're standing there. They now know that they need to just get my attention. And it's not being rude by me or them. It's not that I'm so focused on the telly that I'm ignoring them. It's just because sometimes in my head I'm so flat out just trying to maintain a normalcy that when somebody comes and speaks to me out of the blue, unless they get my attention specifically, I won't notice them. And I'm not being rude or mean or anything like that. And my kids understand that because we've talked about it, because they've heard me talk about what's going on in my head. That sometimes there's just a screaming in my head. And I quite literally can't hear somebody when they're speaking to me in front of my face. I'm looking at their mouth moving. I can hear wah, 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 but it's under this constant if we get to a point where we can talk about our mental illness, if we can have these discussions, if people can see that, hang on, it is an injury. Even somebody, say they were born bipolar for whatever reason, their mind is still injured. It's not that they're cursed or they've got a demon or something. It's the chemicals in their brain didn't come out right for whatever reason. For whatever reason. It's not their fault. I wouldn't choose it. And yet we treat them as other because we don't really understand. We're aware, but we don't understand. So as you know, today I've been going through the 4 reasons why you should discuss your mental illness. Why you should discuss your mental illness is to digest that trauma, to move beyond the trauma, to minimize the trauma, and to inspire others to acknowledge their trauma by speaking out. These are the ways that we can improve the life of people living with mental illness by getting to a point where we understand. And let me just say this, if you've been listening to this whole show, you are on the right path. Why? Because I'm talking about something that you may not understand or comprehend, but you want to. And you're willing to say, hang on, maybe this conversation is important. Maybe this is something that I should make myself aware of. And honestly, I congratulate you for it. I thank you. Probably that's the biggest thing, is just saying thank you. Because maybe my life would be a little bit better because you might be my employer. You might find a way for me to help you or help other people or whatever. You may be a facilitator. Just by even telling other people that, hey, this dude's got a show and it's not too terrible. It's about living with mental illness. Listen in, you'll learn a thing or two. Sincerely and completely, I want to thank you for listening. STP Shattered, the podcast. It comes out officially tomorrow. Wednesday, we're going to have Marriage and Mental Illness, where my wife comes in and she and I discuss what life's like as a married couple living with mental illness. And I've also got an interview coming this week. I'm going to stop calling them interviews because this is more of a conversation. It's with an author, a man who's been in bands. He's been a show promoter, and he's just written a novel, and he lives with mental illness, severe mental illness, and he's a success. I'm really excited to bring that interview. That's coming in later in the week. You can check out all the details on STP. It's on all of our socials, our Facebook, our Instagrams, our YouTubes. You can catch this conversation and many, many more. We do hope that you'll like, subscribe. You'll, if you're listening through Wisdom, that you'll just hit the button that says that. Not sure what it says because I'm not as prepared for this as I should have been. And that's it. I just want to thank you for listening. Right now, if anybody is listening on Wisdom, they have something that they'd like to share, a point of view that they'd like to express, maybe challenge me on something that I said, more than willing for you to guest in at any time. I'm just going to kill a few moments while we're hoping that would happen. I've had a couple of people engage with us through Wisdom, and it's been awesome. Not least of which because it's increased my understanding. I talk about mental illness all the time. I talk about it in person. I talk about it at schools. We don't often get people just disagreeing. Just saying, what did you mean by this? Or I don't understand. Could you please expand on this? And the guests that I've had in Wisdom have been really phenomenal because they've helped me to be a better communicator. And they've brought up issues that I hadn't thought about, which is what I love about the conversations with Marriage with Mental Illness, because we talk about stuff that we've both been through, stuff that we haven't ever sat down and discussed. So I haven't understood my wife's point of view on things. I haven't seen the way that she's observed things that we've been through. And that's just been incredible. So for now, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for listening once again. Have a great week. Marriage and Mental Illness, that'll be coming out on Wednesday, and I'll be releasing an interview on Friday. God bless. Have a great week. Thank you for listening to Shattered, the podcast. I'd like to thank our producer, Meredith Brosnan, our executive producer, Torian Lau, and the band Adelaide for allowing us to use their song as our theme. Go to shatteredthepodcast.com for more information.